So, hello and a very warm welcome to those of you who have just joined us to this very special joint event between ICANN, the Children's Communication Charity, and the Bell Foundation. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just wanted to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. So first of all, our speaker, Louisa, will speak for about 40 minutes. I will say, though, that it is a very interactive webinar. Then we'll move on to questions from the audience, which I will collect and pose to Louisa. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Don't feel you need to wait until the end, because I will be attending to the chat box, and I will be taking all the questions to bring forward to Louisa. So I'm delighted to introduce Louisa Reeves, Head of Impact and Evidence at ICANN. Louisa is a speech and language therapist with 30 years experience of working to support children and young people with speech, language and communication needs. She has been involved in a number of large-scale projects at ICANN, developing evidence solutions for speech, language and communication needs. Her work includes leading on the development and evaluation of ICANN's early Talk Boost and Talk Boost Key Stage 2 language interventions, and the TOTS Talking Parent Intervention for 2-year-olds. So very busy and doing very exciting work.
Oh, thank you, Silvana, and hello everybody.
Louisa. Thank you very much.
It's really nice to see all the comments coming up, so keep them coming, but I'm going to try and not let myself get too distracted from them. I hope that everybody can hear me okay. Silvana, you can hear all right? Yes, great. Okay. So I'm really pleased to be here today, and particularly pleased really to be talking to professionals who are as passionate about language as speech and language therapists are, and hello to the speech and language therapists in the room. But it's been really interesting as we've developed the contents for this program, just talking to Silvana about different ways of looking at language. So what I'm going to do today is really sort of take you through very briefly a short introduction to how speech and language therapists look at language and how that might help you when you're working with children and young people who are bilingual, and to identify whether or not they have they're struggling with language in its entirety, or whether they're learning English as an additional language because they haven't been exposed to that before. So I'm using the term bilingual to include children who speak more than one language, so that would include multi and plural lingualism as well. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about ICANN to start with. So we're a children's charity. We work with children and young people who have communication difficulties, and our vision is here, as you can see, really all encompassing and quite ambitious. So we believe that communication is absolutely vital, and again it's nice to be in an audience where I'm sure that we all agree with that, and we understand that some children struggle to communicate for whatever reason, and as a charity we exist to help those children and young people to really achieve their full potential. So how do we do that? We do that in a number of different ways. Silvana's already mentioned my role in developing programs to help children catch up with their speaking understanding. We do quite a lot of workforce development and training, and we also run 2 special schools for children who have really complex speech, language and communication needs. So we work with a range of children really. Some can catch up with their language and communication with something that is quite short and punchy, and others will have a language disorder as a lifelong condition and they will need more specialist intervention, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail in this talk. So just finally, we do support families directly, and we also have a public affairs and policy role where we try and kind of lobby and influence both national and local government in terms of the importance of speaking and understanding for children's learning and future life chances. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to go through speech, language and communication needs. I'm going to start with looking at speech, language and communication and really sort of presenting that to you as a model for how speech and language therapists look at language, because I think we all look at languages in slightly different ways. We're then going to look at that overlap between speech, language and communication needs and English as an additional language, and how to support and identify children who might have an underlying language difficulty. We're going to look briefly at how to support learners, and then finally working with families, and hopefully we'll have time for a bit of a chat at the end. But one of the things that Silvana and I have talked about is there's an awful lot in this. There's a real conversation to be had, I think, between the two professions and all the other professionals we've got here today. And so we're, Silvana and I, hoping that this is the first of several kind of interactions between the Bell Foundation and ICANN in terms of having those discussions and really trying to unpick the different roles and different impact we can have in working with children and young people and their families. So forgive me if some of this is kind of really familiar, and speech and language therapists, it will be very familiar. But I really wanted just to unpick the terms that make up speech, language and communication, because quite often we use it just in its initials, SLC or SLCN, but it's really useful terminology for speech and language therapists to start to pull apart language, different aspects of language, and that really supports us in identifying where a difficulty may lie. So let's have a look briefly at speech first of all. In speech and language therapy, really what we look at are two aspects of speech sounds, if you like. We look at phonology, which is the rule-based system of producing combinations of sounds which make different words, and that rule-based system is language specific. So bilingual speakers will have a separate phonological system for each of the languages they speak. They may make errors with speech, so speech sound errors that affect their intelligibility in one language, but not actually make those errors in another. So it's really important when we're looking at children who've got a difficulty with speech, who can't make speech sounds or we can't understand them, to unpick whether that's a difficulty with their phonological system, or the other thing that it might be is an articulation difficulty, which is more of a motor function difficulty, so the articulators of the mouth, lips, tongue, soft palate. And children who have an articulation problem are likely to make those errors in all the languages they speak. So why do we need to unpick that difference? Well, that is really significant in terms of the intervention that we're going to make. So there's quite a bit of evidence now that shows that if we work on phonological systems in one language, it doesn't necessarily map over to another language. So we really need to understand that. And as teachers, it's also really important to understand those phonological systems in terms of the contrasting difference between sounds. So for example, in English, r and l have a difference, so we have different words with those sounds in them, but in Japanese those particular sounds don't have a distinctive contrasting meaning. Sh and s have a different contrasting meaning in English, but they don't have the same contrasting meaning in Urdu. In French there are different R sounds, so there's a R and a R, and in English that distinction isn't made. So it's really important that we unpick those speech sounds and really understand what's happening with the child's speech systems in terms so that we can pin down any errors that are being made. And it's also really important, obviously, in terms of working with colleagues in mainstream provision, particularly in terms of their expectation of phonics. So children who are coming in and learning English phonics, but who speak a language at home, or languages at home which don't have those contrastive features, are going to find phonics perhaps harder to tackle than English-speaking children who have come across those phonics, those phonological sounds in their speech system. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to language, and really language is a bit of a portmanteau term here, but we're really looking at this kind of abstract, again, rule-based system of syntax and morphology, so word endings, which carry meaning and that are very rule-bound, so that we can have nonsense rhymes like the 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the waves. So you might know that from the Jabberwocky. It's nonsense, but if I was to ask an English speaker to pick out the nouns and the verbs and the adjectives in that sentence, you could do it because you understand the structure of English. And if we were to have something similar in another language, for native and fluent speakers of that language, they'd be able to identify those different grammatical elements. But of course the sequence and the structure is different from language to language, and it's really important, again, when you're trying to tease out whether a child or a young person is having an underlying difficulty with language, that you understand the structure of all of the languages they speak. So some of you I know are fluent speakers of a number of different languages, but if you're working with a child in a family of a language you're not familiar with, it's really important that you find an adult who is fluent in that language, who can tell you about perhaps the word order of sentences, where the verb goes, how gender is signalled, you know, how to make plurals and how tenses work, so that you can really kind of dig down and see whether the child is actually struggling with their home language, with their mother tongue, as well as with learning English. And the only other note on this that I would add is, and again, apologies if you kind of know all this, but bear in mind the two types of bilingualism. So simultaneous bilingualism is if children are exposed to one or more languages, more than one language, before the age of 3, and sequential bilingualism, which is where they're learning subsequent languages after the age of 3. And interestingly, and again you probably know this, but most of the research done on bilingualism is done on simultaneous learners, because quite a lot of academics tend to use their own children to inform their studies, whereas actually the most common form of bilingualism in the UK is sequential bilingualism. And again, I think that does affect how we approach, how we talk to schools and families about identifying whether children are struggling or whether it's actually just that they are learning English and coming to it at a particular age. So the final area that we look at in terms of speech and language therapy is communication. So this is the very broad, really kind of sending, receiving messages, and this is where we put a lot of the actual unspoken parts of communication that are really important, and that I think we've all found challenging about this kind of life we have now, where we're online and I'm talking away to you. I can't register your faces, I can't see how interested or engaged you are, or whether you've sort of given up, having a little snooze, but that's really important, isn't it? And things like intonation, so that you can tell whether somebody's being sarcastic, whether they're making a joke, all of those things are really, really important, and a lot of them are culturally specific. So it's really important, again, when we're working with different communities, to understand how this aspect of communication works for them. So what are the unwritten rules about eye contact, for example? So particularly with children, in some cultures, as you probably know, it's disrespectful to look an adult in the eye. It might be disrespectful to initiate conversation, but you know, for a child to start speaking to an adult. So all of those things we need to be aware of, and we need to make sure that mainstream colleagues are aware of those differences as well, because almost more than anything else, the way we communicate in its broadest sense is how people judge us. So if we're getting that wrong, then that can really affect how children are perceived as learners within a school, and that can really affect how they then progress through the school. So I'm I've done a brief recap for some of you. For some of you, that might be new in terms of looking at these three aspects. So we tend to put those three together in this portmanteau term of speech, language and communication needs. So that's really children who are struggling for whatever reason with one or more of those different aspects of language. And we have some research which shows us that roughly 1 in 10 children have a lifelong condition with speech, language and communication needs. So that might be something which is part of another difficulty, but it also could be something which is very specific to speech, language and communication itself. And that's really, it's a significant number of children in the classroom, and it's probably a higher number than people realise. So this figure is taken from a UK study, but there is some indication that actually this is fairly consistent across a number of different languages around the world. So just to kind of make that come alive a bit more, that's 3 in every classroom in an average primary school. So we know that likelihood of having speech, language and communication needs rises if you live in an area of disadvantage. And there are a number of reasons why that might be. We don't have time to kind of go into all of those today, but it's not a given that if you live in an area of poverty you will have language difficulties, but we know it is much more likely for a number of reasons. And then finally, just to point out that consistently, year after year, the Department for Education's own figures have shown that children with speech, language and communication needs are much the biggest group of children with special educational needs. They don't necessarily get the education and health plans, but they are the biggest group that schools identify as struggling with. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about speech, language and communication needs, and particularly developmental language disorder, which is the lifelong condition, there's actually quite a lot of publicity on Twitter and online at the moment about the Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder campaign. So if you actually just Google RADLD, it'll tell you about the information and the events for that day. It's on October the 15th, and we can put the link in the chat, but there is actually quite a lot being discussed at the moment in terms of bilingualism and developmental language disorder, and how those two interact. So if you want to learn a bit more after today, I'd point you in that direction. So finally, just on this slide, English as an additional language cuts across all of these. So all of this applies to children who are bilingual, who are learning English as an additional language. So they can also have developmental language disorder. They may also live in an area of disadvantage and so have a speech, language and communication need associated with disadvantage, and they may have other conditions as well. So what we really need to do is to make sure that we're identifying those children who have the speech, language and communication need, almost regardless of what language they have that in, because if they have the need, it will be across all of their languages. So how do we do that? Well, really, it's absolutely vital, isn't it? And sometimes it feels a little bit like seeing the wood from the trees. So we've got some overlapping groups here. We've got the group here who are learning English. We've got the group with typically developing speaking and understanding skills, and then we've got a group with speech, language and communication needs. And we need to be able to pull out those groups so that we make sure that they get the right resources and support at the right time, but also so that children who actually have very very good speaking and understanding skills in their home language don't get labelled as having some sort of special need, when as actually all they're doing is adding another language to their repertoire, but that takes time, as we know. Oh, okay, here we go, in another form. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about our professional body, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. So we have a professional body which provides guidance for us and outlines our role with various different groups of children and adults as well, because speech and language therapists work with children and with adults. So I've pulled out a few things from here, really just to try and tease out this challenge that we have in identifying whether or not the difficulty that a child presents with having a speech and language difficulty, is that actually more about them not being competent English speakers yet because they haven't had that opportunity, or is it because they have an underlying difficulty with language acquisition. So it's very clear in the college guidance that bilingualism is an advantage. It's something to be celebrated, and it's definitely something to be encouraged in the communities and the families we work with, that it doesn't cause or contribute to a speech, language or communication difficulty. But there are some vulnerabilities here. So there are two vulnerabilities. Not sure my slide is coming up here. No. Okay, so I'll talk you through this. So there are two vulnerabilities really. One is that actually diversity is mistaken for disorder, and that's really what I've said. So actually children get labelled as having a need when actually they don't, because they're just at that stage of learning English. But there is also an under-identification in speech and language therapy caseloads. Bilingual children are underrepresented for what we know the statistics tell us of their diversity. And we need to work with colleagues such as you to make sure that we're identifying the right children at the right time for their support. So it's just talking here about understanding the typical bilingual language use, so things like code switching, looking at things like language loss. So that's where perhaps communities have very small communities over several generations might lose some of the language that they speak at home, and some of that might be lost, and therefore it's harder for children then to build on from that language to English, because they're not necessarily having those foundations in strong language, and that really we need to use appropriate assessments and appropriate measures and tools to get as complete a picture as possible of where their skills are. So again, this may be familiar. Certainly the first two are the legal requirements that we have to make sure that no family or child is disadvantaged because of a difference, and that we can't provide inferior care, and that sometimes that means that we have to provide additional services to ensure that families have equal access to care. So it's not necessarily about having the same service, but it's about having equal access to the service. And for bilingual families, that may mean that we need to use speech and language therapy assistants who are bilingual co-workers and interpreters. And we're actually bound by the Healthcare Professional Council standards, which means that we have to ensure that arrangements are made to meet service users' needs. So we need to provide interpreters where they are required, and those interpreters should have at least an NVQ in community interpreting. So speech and language therapy best practice would not be to use family or friends to do interpreting, but to have trained interpreters who understand all these different aspects of language that I've been talking about. The other thing I just want to point out on this slide is that assessment and intervention actually needs to be in the child's mother tongue. So that needs to be delivered in the language which is the strongest language for that child, so that they can develop those skills, and then additional languages can be built on those strong foundations. And the other point on here I've got is about tests and materials. So Silvana and I actually had a bit of a chat about this point. What I'm meaning here is that we have a number of tests which are standardised on an English-speaking population, using what we know about typical development for English language, so the morphology, the syntax, the semantics, and the phonological systems. We can't just translate those measures into another language and expect them to equate across, because we know there are differences between the languages, difference in syntax I've already referred to, difference in vocabulary, so the first vocabulary that children may learn in different cultures and different languages may be very different from the first words that you would expect children to learn in English. We have a typical structure of subject, verb, object in English. Other languages have different structures, so we can't just translate our tests and hope that they would work. Similarly, materials, we just need to be really aware of the cultural differences that sometimes come with bilingualism in terms of the materials that we use. When I was a very newly qualified speech and language therapist, I worked in an area where we had lots of Mirapuri speakers from the Punjabi community, from Pakistan, and we had a test which involved pigs and tables and chairs, and I learned very quickly that not only was that not appropriate culturally, but also that actually children didn't know what they were and wouldn't have been expected to know what they were. So we need to just be constantly reflecting on the sorts of materials that as speech and language therapists we're using to evaluate where children are with their language. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about today, and I think, again, I may be preaching to the converted here, is about this idea about cultural curiosity. So there is an interactive map here. Unfortunately, my ability to link out of this presentation and show you things is not what I would have wanted today, but we'll put some of these links in. But this interactive map is really, it's great because you can actually put in an area and it will map out the languages that are spoken in that area. So if you may very well know the languages that are spoken for the population in your school, but if you're interested to see more broadly in the area that you live in, perhaps, or nearby areas for the school that you're in, it will show you those, and then once you know what languages are out there, you can start to learn about their different structures and how what expectations there are in terms of how children learn language and how they acquire them. So this is really just a recap here. This is from a training course actually that we did some time ago, as you can see from the reference here, but it's actually really useful just to go through this decision tree. So we have the child at the heart of this, and we need to make this determination so that the mother tongue, the home language, and the child speaks is good, so they're coming into school with good Polish skills, but their English language skills are poor. So that's where you come in terms of supporting that child to learn English and to build on their good home language skills. So the other two in green really are where the mother tongue skills are poor. So for example, the family are concerned that actually their Polish skills, for example, aren't as strong as they would expect for their age or in comparison with other children they know, and that's where a speech and language therapist would come in. And equally, where you've actually had a child who's been in school perhaps for a number of years, but what the school is seeing, or what you're seeing, is that actually not only is there some concern about English, but also there's some concern about the mother tongue skills as well. And again, in that case, that's where a speech and language therapist comes in. And just bearing in mind that mother tongue here could stand for a number of different languages at home, because we know that there are some families where there'll be more than one language spoken at home. So it looks quite simple laid out like this, but it's not easy, is it? So really what and again, this is a link which I think you'd find really useful to have a look at, this differential diagnosis checklist, and this website actually I would really recommend to you. So this is the bilingualism, the London Bilingualism Clinical Excellence Network is a piece of speech and language therapy jargon, but they've got a wealth of resources both for speech and language therapists, but also for teachers, for early years practitioners, and for educators around making this differential determination between you know, whether children have a fundamental difficulty in language, or whether they're learning English. So the sorts of things that they're picking up, and our research has shown, is it is things like not code switching. So we know that code switching is a really typical behaviour for bilingual children and adults, and that actually it's a richer form of communication in many ways than sticking to a single language. So not code switching can be an indicator that there is something more fundamental going on. So not going through the 5 stages sequentially, so we're thinking here of the stages of the silent phase, using kind of formulaic speech and shortened phrases, and then increasing competence, and sometimes the 5th stage could be stopping using mother tongue at home, can't it, on a temporary basis. So really you're looking for children who have kind of got stuck at one of those phases, or not going through them, or not progressing as you would normally expect them to when you look at them compared with other children that you work with. And finally here we've got parental concern. So parents know their children best. Often they know their home language best as well, and when you have the opportunity to sort of have that discussion with them, you can often identify that actually they have some concerns about their child's language learning as well. So those areas are kind of red flags for you, if you like. So to start to think about, could this actually be a fundamental difficulty with language? The other pointer here is children who are not speaking at all. So children who are not speaking maybe in either language, children who are speaking some English but actually don't seem to be moving on with their English, so they're not acquiring new words in the way that you would expect them to. And then children who are vocalizing, so they're making sounds, but actually you can't understand what they're saying, and sometimes that could be put down to assumptions made that that's actually the other language. But if you check with families or with a fluent speaker of that language, if they're also spotting that actually they can't understand in that language, then again this is an indicator that there is something underlying which may be problematic. And those of you in early years, this link here is again from that website, and that will help you to give you some pointers to consider. Okay, so some pointers here, and these are kind of, you know, very generalized, aren't they? So you know your individual children well, but in general you would expect to see some progress within the first term, really whatever age the child is. And again, I think that's qualified by the background of, you know, how the child's got to you, so that we know some asylum seeker families have had, you know, very traumatic experiences, and we know that language is particularly vulnerable in developmental terms when children have been exposed to trauma or adverse childhood experiences of any kind. So you'd need to qualify this with your experience of the child and the family. Wait and see can be an issue in schools, can't it? So there is some evidence that with bilingual children, education staff do kind of delay that referral making because they're thinking, well, we'll give them a bit more time and we'll see how they go. And sometimes the clock can reset as children move up through the school. So, you know, they might arrive in the second year of school and go through the year 2 class and not have made much progress within that year, but they start in year 3 and it's felt that, you know, they need another length of time. So if in doubt, seek advice, and speech and language therapy teams are always happy to be contacted. You can contact them for informal advice. You should be able to get to speak to a speech and language therapist who will talk you through some of the issues. They won't be able to give you details about that actual child because you'd need to go through a referral that's agreed with the parents, but they should be able to give you some broad things to have a look at. Okay, so we've got a model here really looking at a bit of a graduated response. So this really forms the basis of a kind of pathway that you might like to look at in your school, and we developed this model working with some early years local authorities looking at their SEND pathway in early years. It's also a model that's been used for some time by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists and by a number of other organisations, really just to look at the levels of input that are required for different groups of children. So we've got this universal level here, which really is about having the workforce who are skilled, who are confident, who are making sure that they're including provision for language and communication, and that parents understand the role that language and communication skills play in their child's lives. Then in this middle section, there are a few children who will need who require more tailored input. That might take the form of an intervention, or it might just be some more differentiation within the classroom. And then there are fewer children still who will need this specialist support that's provided by a speech and language therapist or by an advisory teacher who is working with children and young people with speech, language and communication needs. I think you could probably apply this to English as an additional language support as well. And we've got here that children can go back up and down these levels depending on their individual needs and where they are in time, and also quite often at phase change. So we know that children can do quite well in primary school, and with the move into secondary school, some of those skills can fall back or be because of the different environment the child finds themselves in, they're less able to use the skills they have. So what we are going to do now, I'm just conscious of keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to move us on to looking in a little bit more detail at what these different phases of the triangle, if you like, different areas of the triangle might look like. So these are a few bullets that would give you an idea about what universal good practice would look like in terms of speech, language and communication needs, and obviously that needs to be linked in some schools with awareness of bilingualism and the issues around children learning English as an additional language. So where we have children who've got English as an additional language, bilingual children with speech, language and communication needs, they're going to need more support and they're going to take longer to make progress. So I think we have a poll coming in here. Camille? Oh, fabulous. So we're really just interested to see what tools you've got to look at how you're going to identify children with speech, language and communication needs in your work. So you've got some options down there, and please do vote. So I think in-house and speech and language therapy service ones are neck and neck at the moment. So about 50% of you use one or other, and I think we did give you the option of choosing more than one. So it may be that some of you are using a range of different tools. And again, this is where it'd be really nice to ask you, but we'll have to come back and do that. So I think that's probably, do I end the poll? Perhaps Camille's going to end the poll. Yeah, so we've got 49% in-house, 59% speech, language and language therapy service ones, 7% purchase, 2% using TCT, 16% an ICANN tool, and 14% using none. So there's a range there. And one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that all schools and early years provisions have the tools they need to really support identification, because if you don't know the children are there, it's really hard then to plan for services to support them. So thank you for that, Camille. So when you're looking at creating a communication environment, and there are a number of checklists available online. This one was designed by our sister organisation, the Communication Trust, and it now sits on ICANN's website because the Communication Trust unfortunately is no longer with us. But you can use this checklist. It's free to download, you know, with your setting, with your school, as a way of kind of baselining where you are in terms of how communication friendly you are. You might want to tweak it a little bit if you're in a school that has lots of children with who are bilingual, just to make sure that you're really picking up that difference between the speech, language and communication needs and the bilingualism. But actually, if you've got a communication friendly environment, you're going to support all of those children, and by supporting all of the children, the ones who are struggling are going to show up more easily, because if everybody is supported, the ones that aren't being supported by that universal good practice are the ones where we need to focus our efforts. So what does that focus look like? I think it's really important that we think about targeted strategies and differentiation, as well as interventions, because I think sometimes we want to avoid taking children out of a classroom and doing something separately with them and having them back in. So these are just a few things which you can look at. So differentiating work based on the child's language abilities. So I'm sure that where you're working with bilingual children, you're kind of very used to doing this, translating some materials where they're needed to, but visual structures work fantastically well. And they can be, you know, visual structures and templates can work just as well in a secondary context as in an early years context. The visuals might look different, but that idea of laying something out visually on paper, of ordering it so that students and young people have those clues that are more of a permanent reminder for them, because the spoken word is very ephemeral, isn't it? You know, we speak, you can process the auditory signal and then it's gone. So actually having something that's visual, that's there in front of you, that you can use is really important. You can look at developing word banks, you can look at having a checklist for supporting independence, and this is just some of the ways that you can structure, for example, narrative, so that you've got some hooks really for children to hang their narrative structures on, and you can also look at differentiating questions in the classroom for children who have difficulties, so that you're supporting those children who are struggling with their language. And finally on here, we've got ask, so you can ask young people what they find helpful, and quite often children, particularly older children and young people, you know very well what helps them to learn in the classroom. And one of the things that we're really passionate about at ICANN is supporting young people to have that the confidence to identify when they're struggling with their understanding or their communication, and to seek support for that. So what does targeted look like? Interventions that have a clear evidence base. I think there are loads of interventions out there. Lots of schools use lots of different things. You just need to be very clear about what the outcomes of that are, and that it is evidenced, that it's repeatable, so that if you have one TA who's fantastic at delivering the intervention and they go, can the next person pick it up and run with it and achieve the same effects? It's useful to have everything in the one package, so that TAs aren't running around the school doing photocopying or finding things at the last minute. The research shows us that actually small groups or individuals with high frequency delivery do the best, have the best outcomes, and you need some pre and post measures. So you really want to choose things that are going to support children's language learning, but you may also, if you have a question mark in your mind about whether the child is you know, coming in as learning English for the first time, or being exposed to English as an additional language, or has a speech language communication need, actually some targeted support and intervention might help you to just tease out the difference there. So here's an example of the impact of an evidenced intervention. This is one of ICANN's interventions. So you can see here we've got some RAG rating from the measure that's used before children do the intervention. So you can see we've got quite a few children in red here, which means they've got quite a significant difficulty with their speaking and understanding. There's some at amber, which means they're a bit behind, and some at green, who seem to have still done the intervention. And then you can see the change here afterwards, so more greens. And this is the sort of thing that you're really looking for with the interventions that you choose. We've got another breakdown here of percentage of children kind of narrowing the gap towards green. So how much do they move towards green by? So you can see half the children here close that gap, and that really quite significant numbers narrow it significantly or close it. And then we're able to break down here for different groups. So we've got children who are learning English as an additional language here, in the results here before and after. Again, we've got quite a few children coming in really quite low levels, and many more green. Actually, if you're putting typical language learners into a targeted intervention, you would expect them to do quite well because they're learning English, but this does give you an opportunity to then see if they're not making so much progress, you know, what is it that's happened, what, you know, that gives you an indicator that might be something happening with language across the board. So finally, if you think back to the triangle, we're at the top of the triangle, but it's not a hierarchy. I think it's just in terms of the kind of numbers of children. So the speech and language therapy, that this specialist level is where you're needing to bring external support for individual learners, and that most often is from a speech and language therapist for children are likely to have speech, language and communication needs or developmental language disorder, but there are specialist teachers out there as well. So co-workers working with speech and language therapy service need to make sure that they speak the home language of the children that they're looking at. These are some of the things that therapists can do. So they will assess and make a diagnosis, but they'll also help to develop advice and strategies. So what do we look at? We look at all the languages that a child speaks or hears. We have some guidance which states very clearly, and I'm sure that this is something that you are really strong with as well, that speech therapists never advise that children should give up their mother tongue or the home language in order to support English. We know that doesn't work in terms of supporting learning English, but it also doesn't work in terms of cultural and family relationships. We may set a programme for in the home language which needs to be carried out by home language speakers, and that programme might cut across different settings and environments. So referral, every speech and language therapy will have a slightly different way of accepting referrals. They should have some specific guidelines relating to referral of bilingual children, and they will need to know when you refer them all the languages a child hears at home. And if you do routinely work with an interpreter, it's really useful if you pass those details on, so the speech and language therapy service can use the same interpreter as well. So just finally in this sort of gallop through, a couple of things about working with families, and I think this is a kind of a refrain that's sort of run through, asking parents about their child's abilities in their home language. It needs to be quite specific, so you might need to ask for details about what the child can say to get an idea of the sentence structure, the type of vocabulary they're using, and perhaps the circumstances in which they're talking. If there's more than one language at home, you know, who talks which language, what language do they use? Do they have a, you know, different one when they're talking about homework, from talking to grandparents, from, you know, sort of every day around, you know, having a meal. And again, probably preaching to the converted here, but not expecting parents to automatically engage in regular conversation with children. That actually they might need to go away and have a little bit of a think about their child's language skills. So explaining to parents about expectations. So this is what I would expect the child to be saying in school. These are the sorts of things I would expect them to be doing. Is that the same in your home language? What do you think about that? You could ask them to record and have a bilingual co-worker, or if you're a bilingual speaker yourself, to listen to it just to get a feel for how competent they are with their home language. You must get parental consent, and it must be informed consent for referral to speech and language therapy. So you may need a bilingual co-worker to talk you through talk the parents through that consent form. And then again, really reinforcing the importance of good mother tongue language skills at home. So it's really important to keep that home language going, and that English will be built on that really strong foundation. Okay, so there's another checklist here. This is really looking at for older children, but you could use this with families as well. So this is talking about, you know, which languages do you use, how often, who do you use them with, and what do you use them for. And I think it's always useful to understand language proficiency in terms of you know, function, where language is used. And I have reached the end, so I'm conscious that I've really galloped through a lot of that. I'm sorry that we didn't have the interaction that we'd planned, but I can see there's been loads of stuff in the chat. We'll put all the links in, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to come back and have a bit more of a discussion with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much for such an interesting, informative webinar full of resources and suggestions. So thank you. Louisa, I'm going to be asking you quite a few questions that have been, you know, appearing on the chat as you were speaking. So the first question comes from Sarah, and she says, as there can be a silent period for children who are new to English, how long do you give it before you would raise a concern about SLCN?
It all depends on context, doesn't it? So I think, you know, if you look at the research, that silent period it tends to be quite short, I think, depending on the age of the child, but you wouldn't expect it probably to go on for weeks and months. You know, it might be as short as a few days, depending on how they're settling in, but the context of their background as well. So as I said, you know, if you have asylum seeker families and they've, you know, had a very traumatic experience, then silence might actually be part of the child's response to that, in which case you're looking at broader support. But in general, I would expect that silent phase to be really quite short, because children are natural language learners. You know, they acquire languages like sponges. I think we constantly have to remind ourselves as native English speakers that this country is very rare, England, in only having one language. That actually, I don't know, I'm going to say 90%, probably somebody will correct me, but other countries in the world have more than one language that children just speak.
Our Welsh friends
so
would disagree with you. Sorry, Sarah.
Well, I did say specifically England.
Yeah.
Because Wales is its own country. It's part of the UK, but it's its own country, and Scotland and Ireland, Northern Ireland as well.
Thank you. The second question comes from Carrie, and she says, we're a charity serving a predominantly Jewish community where Hebrew and Yiddish are the primary languages for most of our families, and they deliver an intervention in English as the schooling is mostly in English. And she says, we do not have capacity or resources for delivering in Hebrew and Yiddish, and would have to close the service if we're required to do this. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this better than nothing, do you think?
Well, it depends on what your purpose is in delivering the intervention. So you don't say whether you're a speech and language therapy service, but I'm assuming not. So it depends on what the interventions are for, really. If what you're aiming to do is, you know, if the children are struggling in Yiddish and Hebrew so that they have a language difficulty, then actually an intervention in English, whilst it might help them to learn English, it won't address the underlying language deficit. But if what you're wanting to do is to give them an introduction to English and a sort of bit of a fast track, if you like, into English, then I think that's absolutely fine. But if you're working with children who have an underlying language difficulty, so a speech and language communication need, then it wouldn't be fine to intervene in English. Does that make sense? So it really depends on your purpose.
And she did say, Carrie did say, yes, it's a speech and language charity. Okay, service. Thank you. A question from Ellen. How do you assess a child's language skills in their mother tongue if schools do not have staff with the language skills to assess in various languages spoken among students?
Well, I think that's where your speech and language therapy service should come in. I know that some services do have constraints, but they have a legal obligation to have access to interpreters. I think there's a step before that where you're needing to do your best endeavours to find fluent speakers of that language to help you to try and tease out whether as I'm saying, it's an underlying difficulty, or whether it's that the child is learning English for the first time. And that's not necessarily a formal assessment, is it? That's about having somebody who's a fluent speaker, who knows something about language development, so knows what to expect for a child of of that age. So, what should a typical 5-year-old be saying if they're a Kurdish speaker, for example, or a Polish speaker? What would you expect in terms of the length of the sentence, the sort of tenses and plurals they'd use? So, find somebody in the school or in the local community who speaks that language, and have a discussion with them about, these are the sorts, what would you expect a 5-year-old, what would you expect a 10-year-old to do, and can you have a conversation with them in which you're trying to explore some of those things?
Thank you.
But it is a challenge. I will, there are no easy answers, particularly where you've got, 100 languages in your school, or, even 10 languages is a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, a challenge we also have in EAL, actually. Thank you. Rochelle wants to know, which other evidence-based programs would you recommend other than Talk Boost at a targeted level?
Well, I do know, I don't know which ones have been evidenced in terms of English as an additional language. I mean, there is the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which lots of schools will have because the government's made that freely available. So that's a catch-up intervention in reception. I don't, as I say, I'm not aware of what their evidence is in terms of English as an additional language. There is some information on the Education Endowment Fund website for evaluated interventions, so that would probably be the best place to start. There's also something called What Works on the ICANN website, which is again a database of evidenced speech and language therapy interventions, so you could have a look on there and see what there is specifically around English as an additional language.
Thank you. Claire would like to know if there's a register of bilingual SALTs.
Not that I know of. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists might be able to help you, point you in the direction. I'm just trying to think. There's a network of private speech and language therapists called ASLTIP, Association of Speech and Language Therapists in Private Practice, and they have therapists who say what they specialise in. So you might find someone there, but they'd be private rather than NHS ones. I'm not aware of a national database.
Thank you.
I might be corrected in the chat, in which case
I'll watch.
We'll put that in.
I'll watch. Hannah, in the meantime, says, if a child has severe learning difficulties, would you advise parents to continue to converse in 2 or more languages with the child?
I would, but I would probably advise them to supplement that with some form of total communication, so using sign and symbol, objects of reference, but depending on kind of what stage the child is at cognitively, so that you've got some support for the languages. But if they're if one parent speaks one language and one speaks the other, then you can think about how you're going to use that and support a child to learn. I think it's so important that children have that exposure to the language that's part of their heritage. If in doubt, though, I would ask a speech and language therapist who knows that individual child well, and they can give you much more nuanced information than I can.
Thank you. And the last question for you, Louisa, today. Peter would like to know, what tools do you use to evaluate the progress shown on the impact graphs that you showed us?
Is that for the talk? That's for the Talk Boost, the coloured graphs. So we have, so we have a measure that's based on developmental, what's typical English language development, that we ask the schools to do first with the child, then they do the intervention, and then they repeat the same measure, and you can upload those scores onto an online tracker, and it'll produce the graphs for you, but you can also tick a box to share the data anonymously with ICANN, and so we gather the data from I think we've got several thousand on the database, so that we can look at those, those kind of very broad scores. So it's a before and after measure, but it's not a standardized score.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Thank you for all your questions, dear audience, today. Thank you very much for your wonderful and generous, presentation, your generous time to be here with us today, and for all the insights, all the tools, all the suggestions, all the advice, incredibly practical and useful. So thank you so much, Louisa.
So you're going to save the chat, Silvana, because I'd really like to read it.
I will save it. Can I just say I will round up now, but before I close the webinar, I wanted to remind you all that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar and the survey, and we will also publish all the links that Louisa has put up in her presentation so that you have them there in the very same place. Our next webinar is on supporting early career teachers with learners who use English as an additional language, and the speaker will be yours truly, I'm afraid. This will take place on Wednesday the 13th of October at 4 p.m. We also have an online course starting on the 4th of October for 4 weeks, and it's called Language Awareness for Teaching Staff, and this course develops awareness of how the English language works and focuses on the areas of English known to be more difficult for learners who use English as an additional language, and it offers practical strategies regardless of a teacher's subject area or specialism. So please check the Bell Foundation's website for details. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this webinar, and thank you again, Louisa, for your great presentation, and have a good evening. We will stop recording now, and I'm going to end the meeting now.